So the reason I started the book in 1962 is because in the spring of 1962, a group of ROTC students at the University of Oklahoma decided they really had to start an alternative student newspaper. There's too much conformity, there's too much of an emphasis on downplaying controversy, and so there's this quest for knowledge and trying to get people to think. And so that theme gets picked up by another group of students at OU who start a Marxist reading club. And it's a very small group of students, but they were just interested in new ideas. And they were also interested in Oklahoma's more radical past that a lot of people had forgotten about, which is that at one time in the 19-teens, prior to the start of World War I, Oklahoma had the largest socialist population of any state in the Union. And so they start making connections back to that. So they're reading Marxist literature, but then they're also reading about Oklahoma socialists. And out of that group emerges the first chapter of Students for a Democratic Society in the state of Oklahoma. And so they filled out the paperwork to become an official student organization, and it gets flagged pretty quickly because the administration realizes that there will be questions about Students for a Democratic Society. And so they kind of monitor it, and within a year's time they're getting complaints from the governor wanting to know exactly what this organization is, if it's causing any problems on campus. And to put it in perspective, Students for a Democratic Society at OU, you know, on average would have 12 members, 20 members. It's a very small organization. But because of the national opposition to SDS, increasingly, it gets a lot of attention. And so they started a student newspaper, SDS Voice, and members of the state legislature would occasionally get copies of it. If they saw any reference to socialism, Marxism, race relations, anti-war, they would underline those, and then President George Lynn Cross at OU would get letters complaining about the students, wanting to know what could be done to stop this organization. And so what happens is that you continue to see surveillance of students that are involved in SDS at both the University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University. The Oklahoma City field office for the FBI has to keep tabs on New Left activism in the state. And at one point, you know, in one of their reports in the mid-1960s, the Oklahoma City field office says, look, there are only 3 or 4 students in SDS at Oklahoma State University, and we think maybe a dozen at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, and they don't seem to be planning anything other than a few minor anti-war protests. And so because of that, we don't really have any plans right now to try and do anything about them. Not much is going on. And J. Edgar Hoover actually responds and says, the fact that you've indicated in your previous memos that 2 chapters of SDS exist in the state means that you need to develop a plan to neutralize them. I look forward to hearing your plans. And so I think part of the story of what happens in Oklahoma in a national context is, you know, the notion that 3 SDS members at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, that merited an FBI counterintelligence plan to try and neutralize it, or that the FBI would feel the need to invest in finding informants, which they did at the University of Oklahoma to try and get rid of SDS, is kind of mind-boggling at a certain level. That there would be that level of national insistence by J. Edgar Hoover that SDS had to cease to exist, that it was a matter of national security that you completely obliterate this organization. And no organization, save maybe the Black Panthers in the 1960s, gets more attention from the FBI than Students for a Democratic Society. So it's really quite staggering what happens in terms of the surveillance culture. And while all of that is going on, it still wasn't enough to satisfy the governor of the state. So Governor Dewey Bartlett in March of 1968, following a student protest against General Lewis B. Hershey, who is the director of Selective Service. It's a small demonstration in Oklahoma City, and that convinces Governor Bartlett to create a secret agency to spy on suspected radicals in the state. You know, and these are students that are arrested and quickly released. Zero violence takes place. And when Governor Bartlett creates the Office of Interagency Coordination, he doesn't tell the state legislature and doesn't ask for their approval. And so what they did is they housed it in the Department of Military, and they diverted National Guard funding to pay for this secret agency. And over the next 2 years, they amassed files on over 6,000 suspected radicals in the state and outside of the state. 1970 is really a turning point in what happens in Oklahoma. It's true nationally as well, but part of what happens in Oklahoma is that not only does the Office of Interagency Coordination get exposed, but May of 1970, shortly before this expose is released, May of 1970 marks the most volatile period in the United States for anti-war protest because of what happens with the massacre of 4 unarmed students at Kent State in May of 1970. And one of the more interesting things that happens in Oklahoma is the way that students and the administration and the governor's office will respond to student protest following the events at Kent State. So essentially what happens is that as students begin finding out on May 5th what happened at Kent State, that these unarmed students were killed by the Ohio National Guard, you have vigils across the country. There are vigils on half a dozen college campuses in Oklahoma. University of Oklahoma is no exception. There are a lot of students who are deeply troubled by what has happened. And as this is playing out, the governor, Dewey Bartlett, wants to send in the National Guard, wants to make sure that the school stays open, is eager to use force if necessary to keep students from protesting. And what happens at the University of Oklahoma is quite unique, because on May 5th, there is a demonstration against the war in Vietnam and to express anger and frustration over the deaths of the Kent State students. And this particular demonstration on May 5th becomes violent. There's a student who waves a red flag. He is arrested by the police. They believe he has waved a Viet Cong flag, and he gets arrested by the police. Students surround the police car. They're trying to keep it from moving forward. They let the air out of the tires. There's an effort to kind of attack the car. One person even tries to light a rag and put it in the gas tank to set it on fire. I mean, this is the moment. This is the moment of intense fear at OU. In the midst of all of this, one of the police officers loses his gun, and they don't know who has it. And so there are several moments where it's extraordinarily tense, and they're trying to figure out what to do. A student finds the gun and returns it to a police officer, so that moment of crisis passes. But it took the use of state troopers to free the police car, get the young man that had been arrested and 2 other students that also got arrested, get them removed from the premises. There are a couple of dozen students that are injured when all of this chaos breaks out. Only 1 student goes to the hospital, so it certainly could have been a lot worse. And to put it in context, you know, there are 400 universities and colleges across the country that closed down in this time period. National Guard units are called in over 24 times across the country. So it is an intense period of conflict. And at the University of Oklahoma, after the May 5th incident, this whole plan is put together between the university administration, campus security, student leaders, and more radical activists kind of outside of student government. And the whole intent is to protect students and allow them the opportunity to voice their frustration and to protest. And the whole idea is to protect student lives. And the governor really wanted to send in the National Guard to stop demonstrations from happening. All of this culminates on May 12th when students are preparing for the big end of the year ROTC parade, and students are planning a protest, and the governor wants to send in the National Guard to stop it from happening, and he's got them located just off campus. You know, there are a few hundred highway patrol that are off campus waiting to converge on Norman if the possibility rises. And what campus security realizes, look, if state troopers come back on campus, and especially if the National Guard comes back on campus, somebody's going to get killed. And in one particularly tense moment, the governor, who's got people on campus reporting back to him about the protest and what's going on, and he's ready to send in the National Guard during the May 12th parade. And the president at the time, so George Lynn Cross had retired, President Holloman was in office at that point. He says he's going to send in the National Guard, and President Holloman says, if you do that, then I will notify everyone that the blood is on your hands. If you make this choice, students will get hurt, and everyone will know that it was your call. Do not do this. And he's really trying to beseech the governor to respect the lives of students and understand that if they come on campus, people will be hurt. I think one of the things nationally now is that there's not enough tolerance for diverse perspectives. And that is perhaps a lesson to be learned, that on the one hand, you don't want to lump all activists into the single category. On the other hand, it's important both, you know, when you think about free speech issues today, both to allow on college campuses voices of dissent, whether they are, you know, far to the left or far to the right, that's fundamental to a democracy, is to engage in free speech. But to shut down free speech and to only be willing to listen to things that reinforce your own worldview is antithetical to democracy, for one thing. And for another, it undermines what college life should be about, which is exposing students to new ideas, giving them the opportunity to make their own decisions and reach their own conclusions. And I think that's one of the really important lessons that can be taken nationally from student activism